Welcome back, everyone. Hope you had a nice lunch break. Our afternoon sessions begin with a topic that's useful, whether you're in court over Zoom, emailing with colleagues or clients. It's managing disputes and being, creating meaningful resolutions. So we have an expert with us for that, Ray Kyritsi, who's a certified mediator and the programs director at Center for Conflict Resolution. So thank you, Ray. Take it away.
Thanks so much, Brent. Hi, everybody. How's it going? We're all enjoying another long day of looking at each other on the internet. I see that the overwhelming majority of you have your cameras off, which is fine. I'm happy to talk into the nothing for a while. However, in a little bit, we're going to move into breakout rooms, and I'm going to ask that you turn your cameras on for that. So just so that you have an awareness, so that when you're doing communication with your colleagues, you're able to pop those cameras on. Again, if you have any safety or privacy concerns, you certainly aren't obligated to do so, but it will make the exercise quite a bit better. So real quick, again, of course, I leave it to you. I have no doubt that this is not your first day on Zoom, but just in case it is, you might want to move to speaker view instead of gallery view, because I am very, very tiny right now in gallery view. And again, my name is Ray Kyritsi. I am the programs director at the Center for Conflict Resolution. So today I'm going to talk to you about conflict management. Generally, some skills you already will definitely know. Some things might be some new ideas and approaches. But before we do that, if I could just get, just using the reaction buttons, just some thumbs up of who just loves conflict, who just loves it. There's usually a couple. Yep. Okay. Seth. All right. So just the one, huh? Okay. That's interesting. Why? Why didn't you all just light up your screens to tell me how much you love conflict? You can unmute yourself or feel free to use the chat feature. Anybody have any thoughts? Why didn't we all just jump up and down? By the way, I love conflict. So it's me and Seth, I think. Anybody? Conflict is vulnerable? Yeah, great. Stressful, absolutely. Anybody ever lose sleep over a conflict? Anybody ever lose sleep over a conflict that the other person actually maybe didn't entirely know they were in with you? I am in a fight with my mom all the time that she doesn't know about, right? Just like that, you know what, the next time I'm going to say, right? Like, it's just like a thing. It's just like a thing that happens. Yeah. I prefer peace. Yeah. Beautiful. It takes too long to engage in conflict. And I hate when people are mad at me. Oh, I hate that feeling. One of my employees got chastised today by a judge for a thing that wasn't her fault. And she is like a grown adult woman. And I got upset about it, right? Because like suddenly I'm 7 and I don't want to be in trouble. Also, the judge was wrong, right? Which it turns out isn't worth as much as you want it to be. Yeah, absolutely. Depends on the situation. Josh, Thigpen there. Yeah, it depends. It's so much easier to have a different kind of conflict with someone you know and trust, right? And people have different conflict approaches. Everyone who's ever had to cohabitate with me, like, has to do like a lot of conflict engagement, which is frankly exhausting. You know, like, it seems like a great skill set until I'm like, can you tell me what's important about leaving dishes in the sink? Like, that's obnoxious, right? Like, it can be just too much, but it's easy to go that way and do that kind of work and get in with people that we know well. It can, anxiety for sure. Oh, Anna, thanks. Okay, there you go. Another thumbs up. You, me, and Seth. Provides room to grow, for sure. I think one of the ways to think about conflict is that it can really, really be an opportunity. That's like a framing I'd love for you to hold as we start to think about it. Patricia has a great note there, right? I'm good at other people's conflict. Yeah, you should look into mediation. You know, I know a lot of professional mediators who in their lives are conflict avoidant. They're like, please don't make me talk about it. I would love to talk about your conflicts. I don't want to talk about my conflicts. For sure. For sure. Yeah, and Tamela, Knight, right? I like it. It can prevent resentment and stuffed feelings. Stuffed is a great way to talk about when we sort of squish those feelings down and like hold them in our belly. We're going to talk about emotions in quite a bit here. So in just a moment, I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to put up a PowerPoint for you. But yeah, thank you so much. I really appreciate you being these contributions here. But I think it's worth thinking about, you know. I think that also there's some language that we have about conflict colloquially, right? If I say she's conflict avoidant, that's not generally considered a compliment, right? Like that has a value attached to it. But I think that knowing when it's worth it to engage and when it's not, that's a real value. My employee today who got chastised by a judge who was wrong about a thing that he didn't understand, she opted out of engaging in a conflict with him. Probably a really good choice, right? Because what else is happening between a case manager in a courtroom and a judge? We got a power dynamic, right? So when you might choose not to engage in a conflict is when you don't have as much of the power, or where maybe whatever's at stake is not important. That the judge doesn't totally understand an email process, maybe not totally worth our time to check in about today, right? It's kind of choosing one's times for engagement. If you have any trouble with the tech, of course, please do let me know in the chat, raise your hand, or feel free to unmute yourself and give a shout out. I can't share my whole screen because there's a million things going on. So give me just a second here so that this PowerPoint shows up first. There we go. Okay, so you should be seeing this shared screen. If you're not or having any tech trouble, do let us know. So today we're going to talk about some really specific communication skills that lead us to successful conflict engagement. And again, thinking about a conflict as an opportunity, right? A lot of the times when we end up in conflict, I like to think of it as like a poorly planned transition or change, right? Or like sort of a misunderstanding of expectations. We see that a lot when people who end up coming to mediation. And just a real quick aside, at CCR where I work, we provide mediation services to any type of people in any type of case for absolutely no charge. And in the mediation, it's a chance for parties in conflict to meet with a neutral third party, have a conversation about whatever's going on for them, and see if they're able to resolve it in a way that's going to work for everybody. So that's the kind of framing and skill set that I come from. I'm also an adjunct faculty at Loyola, where I teach alternative dispute resolution and mediation. So there are a handful of skills around communication that can really serve us when we're in a conflict or when we might be in one, right? Like some of these skills can be really helpful to avoid future conflicts. So today we're going to talk about active listening, summarizing and reflective listening, effective question asking, and emotions work, right? So that maybe we don't suffer so much from those stuffed emotions, which I just love that phrasing. Thank you so much for that. So how do you demonstrate good active listening? Let's use the chat again. How would you know that someone was a good active listener? Nodding and eye contact, body language, feedback, totally. Engaging in the conversation. Oh, asking questions, relevant questions, focusing questions. Informed responses, summarization, mirroring emotions if appropriate. Yeah, for some of you that are going to be doing like intake and public interest spaces where you might have people who are like really coming in and they have to like tell a story of a traumatic experience, right? Like you might be like drafting an affidavit or something like, yeah, engaging around those emotions is really, really, really helpful. Repetition and reframing, follow-up questions, listening and processing. Oh yeah, listening and processing your words instead of planning for their response. Right? We all know we've all had that experience. I mean, like, look, y'all, we don't have time for it, but I've got the best New Year's Eve story. 2005, Prague. You've never seen anything like it. Which means if I'm at a party or a dinner, which are things we used to do before the pandemic, and people are talking about New Year's Eve stories, there is definitely a point where I start checking out and waiting to drop my story because I've got a big story for you, right? And I am not as great a listener about New Year's Eve stories because I'm like, I should go last. I'm going to bring the house down, right? So I think we're all guilty of that. It's really easy to do that. And I think that a lot of those things around not being a good active listener are exacerbated by being on Zoom. Brett, I'm going to call on you real quick, and I'm going to do a quick stop share so that folks can definitely see you and I. So, Brent, can you just give me a sense of like, how's the training going today? How's the orientation been?
Going pretty well. We're over Zoom, but we have over 100 people here. Ray, are you still there?
Oh, yeah. Sorry. No, I'm here. I'm totally there. Sorry, you're saying you have a couple hundred people here?
So yeah, lots of people are here. They were chatting back at the last session this morning. Lots of people.
Okay, I'm going to let you stop because that's miserable for everyone to watch, right? That's horrible. That's like a nightmare watching Brent talk to me while I am clearly on a telephone, right? That is so terrible. And I think I do the same thing when we're in person. In fact, I usually turn my whole human body away from the speaker while they're speaking. But I think that we can see how easy it is for those distractions to sort of start creeping up on us, right? I could also be real quick, just checking my email real quick, and you can tell, right? I think that the virtual dialogue gives us a chance to really see when we're not doing a good job of listening. So Brent, I'm going to ask you again, if you could tell me how orientation is going. I'm going to try to lift up some of the skills that folks were naming earlier.
Yeah, so it's going really well. People were interacting with the speaker this morning. Mm-hmm. People came back after lunch, which is always great.
Great sign.
Yeah. Seems like people are here and ready to talk about conflict resolution. Mm-hmm. So
did you get the number of RSVPs you expected? Are you good with the virtual turnout?
We got actually a little bit more people here than I expected. So that's always very exciting. Yeah.
Okay, that was way less uncomfortable to watch, right? That was much more comfortable to watch because I was doing the things that you said. What is definitely strange about it, right? And I think that we can all sort of oscillate around what we think the stronger skill is, right? So when I'm doing this, I'm looking at where Brett appears on my screen. I can also give you one of these, but I think that gets pretty intense pretty fast, right? When you're just right into the camera. But I mean, look, you've all been doing virtual school. You've all been engaging in Zoom. We've all had too many Zoom happy hours. You certainly all know how to do it. But I think that it's worth thinking about that sometimes things that are really obviously distractions, really obviously cues for the degree to which you're listening, they're harder to do on Zoom, right? One of the things I've learned as a Zoom instructor and a Zoom communicator of this time is that I feel like I'm giving out 120% of what I used to do in a regular classroom, and I'm getting back about 50%, right? It just feels like Zoom takes more energy than it gives back. And I think that's true if you're on the listening end also, right? I have taken classes on Zoom in the last year, and I have that same experience, right? So I think that I would imagine that for a lot of you, your work this summer, of course, there's 100 of you on the call. It's going to look different for everyone, but some of you are probably going to still be doing some work virtually, maybe a large percentage of your work virtually. And I think that we all know that virtual communication is just not as strong as in person, maybe for better or worse, right? We have a really high conflict case type where we mediate civil stalking no contact orders between parties. So essentially it's a variation on an order of protection. Those do so well on Zoom because when you put people who are in really high conflict in a room together, they get fired up really fast, right? But when you put them on Zoom together, it's a lot easier for them to take a break. So I think that you can also think of it as advantageous if you have a high conflict, but really keeping in mind how we're showing up, how we're using those active listening skills, and that sometimes Zoom is a support and sometimes it isn't. So I have a list of active listening skills, and I think we totally got them. Body posture is a big one. And then, of course, what else is happening in your space? I think we've all certainly been in the Zoom call where someone was there, and then they're doing one of these, and they're clearly talking to a person over here, right? And I think that my hope is that we're all a little softer and understanding that people are juggling a lot of things while they're engaging in virtual spaces. But in particular, I think if you're client forward focused or if you're getting specific instructions, as much as you're able to take responsibility for creating a good space where you're able to listen and communicate, I encourage you to really do that. There's also a point in here that I saw a little bit in the chat, but want to highlight, which is being non-judgmental about what's being said, right? So not putting an assessment on it, right? So really and you can do that in that sort of staying neutral idea by reflecting back what's happening. Also a really powerful skill when you're trying to demonstrate good active listening is the effective use of silence. And if you are a verbal processor, or if you know someone who's a verbal processor, this can be really hard to do. This was a particularly challenging skill that for me to master over time. But I really like to lift it up and name it for folks, because of all the skills I have mastered in my career as a mediator, learning to use silence with intention is the one that's had the greatest impact on my personal life. And here's why. I am a verbal processor, and I tend to ask a question, right? And then if someone doesn't answer me right away, I'm like, let me ask that question again for you a new way to help you out, right? So now I've given someone a new second question. Yeah. Actually, I did it 5 minutes ago when I was demoing active listening. I asked Brent 2 questions in a row. I said, what were the RSVPs and did you have as many people as you expected? Those aren't the same question, right? Like, that's just a communication instinct of mine. And then I had to remember to be quiet and listen for the answers. But another thing that some people do, that you might have this skill set as well, is sometimes it's nice to try to help a person decide what it is that they're trying to say. So I sometimes was guilty of asking a question that really was my suggestion, right? So like, is it going well? That's a very narrow question where clearly I think it's going well, right? Or I am assuming that it's going well. I'm checking to see if it's going well. It's different from how is it going? We're going to talk about question asking in another minute, but what can be most effective, instead of trying to give people language or guess at what they're trying to say, is to give them the space and silence to think about what they want to say if they're not a verbal processor, and then to tell it to you. And sometimes if you're the kind of person who loves to talk and loves to listen, that silence can be rather uncomfortable to sit in. But I encourage you to think of it as a skill, in particular if you're in some challenging conversations this summer as you're in your clinic or in your lives. So I think I touched on this a little bit, but does anyone have any other thoughts about using the virtual platforms, or is your work virtual this year? Do you all know? Is it virtual? Is it hybrid? Brent or Sophia, do you know? Is it kind of both for folks?
They kind of answered a little bit of this morning. It looks like mostly virtual, but there are maybe 30 to 40% that's a little bit more of a hybrid in person.
Okay. Yeah.
Lots of virtual on here though.
Yeah, lots of virtual. Yeah. So I mean, I think that there's, I imagine that there's no one quite yet who's like fully in person, so I think that we can also really think about using the virtual platform to our advantage when we're communicating. And also, if I may, please make sure you are taking breaks from sitting in front of these horrible, wonderful, amazing computers, because we're so much better at our work when we have some space for some care around it. And I think that the virtual world tends to suck us in and sort of hold on to us more than the non-virtual world. So I want to talk about asking questions. So there are 2 different types of questions that I was a little bit demoing a moment ago. And those are open questions and closed questions. I'm sure that a lot of you have heard this concept before, but in theory, right? So an open question is one that can have a very broad, responsive answer. A closed question is much more narrow. Okay. How's it going is an open question. Is it going well is a closed question. Okay. And so there is, I want us to take an opportunity to really think about using these different types of questions. And so, you can see here some examples of open versus closed questions. What time did it happen? That's closed, right? That's got a very specific one-word answer. Usually yes, no, Sunday, right? That kind of a thing. Open questions can really go anywhere. You're going to get really broad, open, expansive answers from people. How did you feel about that? What brings you here today? What was your understanding? What do you want to see happen? Right? That sort of a thing. So what I'm going to do right now is put you all into breakout rooms. This is the time I'm going to ask you to please have your camera on. If you get to your breakout room and there isn't another person there, come on back to the main room and we're going to reassign you. So please be patient. This might take a few minutes for the tech. Once there's 2 of you in the room, I would like you to assign yourselves A and B. It doesn't matter. One of you be A, the other be B. And then I'm going to put some instructions into the chat it's not the chat, right? It's the announcements thing at the top of the screen Remember, that will disappear on you after a minute because Zoom doesn't understand what we need functionally sometimes. So yeah, decide who's A and B, and then I'll start putting in some instructions in just a few minutes. So I guess if someone's watching the recording later, it might be worth telling you what's happening right now. So folks are in breakout rooms. The first cue they were given is that A should ask B only closed questions to learn about their childhood. And then after a minute, I gave a new instruction, which was for B to ask A questions about their childhood using only open questions. All right, everyone, we're working our way back. Give me just a minute here. And soon, of course, people will be whisked back in with us whether they want to or not. Which is, without a doubt, the best feature of the breakout room. You can say, come on back, we need you in the main room. All right. So the rooms are closed, so everyone should be coming on back to us in the main room. So when I do this in person, you can hear, right, we're all in one big room and people just turn to their partner and you can hear all the questions that are being asked, right? So real quick, just go ahead and pop into the chat. For those of you that had to ask closed questions, how many questions were you asking? If you were asking the closed questions, a lot. Yeah, a lot. That's a very good answer. Tons. Yeah, it's really focused. Yeah, maybe 5 or 10 questions. If you were asking the open questions, how many questions did you ask? 2. Yeah, maybe 3. Yeah. You can typically, if you've got a talker on your hands, you can ask 1. What do you want to tell me about your childhood? There we go, right? There are some people, I could go for an hour alone on that. I mean, right? Super easy to talk about that, you know? But when you're asking those, right? So I think what I love about this exercise is it just really demonstrates a couple of critical things about how we think about questions and how we ask questions. In particular, I want to talk to you about when we're thinking about asking those closed questions, right? So there are a lot of questions that people ask that kind of can be the same. One of my favorites was a time that there were 2 people talking and one of them was like, do you have siblings? Yes. How many siblings? 3. Do you have a brother? Yes. Do you have a sister? Yes. Do you have 2 brothers? Yeah, right. Like when you're asking these closed questions, right? You're like, it can get really bizarre if you're like trying, right? But what's interesting about that is that if I said childhood, right? You could have when you asked that open question, you might have gotten all different types of feedback, right? Like if someone asked me about my childhood, I might talk about how much I love the Wisconsin Dells because I was raised in the Midwest and my dad and I used to go there when I was a child. And it's the water park capital of the world, right? Which is not the same as other people who might want to tell you about like how they played soccer or how they love dogs or something, right? Like when you ask an open question, you get a lot of data from the person who's answering the question, yeah? But when you ask a closed question, you're also giving away something about yourself. So one of the questions that I ask in this exercise is, how many parents did you have growing up? So if that is a question that I am asking you, what is something you might be able to deduce about me? Go ahead, you can unmute yourself or chat. Do you have any ideas?
You might have also had a few parents growing up or different sets of parents?
Yeah, I probably didn't have like a mom and a dad, right? I probably didn't have two parents. I probably had one parent or three or four or five or six, right? And the answer is four. I had four parents growing up, right? But like you can deduce that because not everyone asks that question, right? And another version of that is so great. I was once doing this exercise and the woman who was asking me a question asked me, did I go to a co-ed school? What do we know about her?
She didn't.
She didn't, right? Because if you go to a co-ed school, if you go to a public co-ed school, which is generally the norm, you're probably not going to ask about it, right? And so our own, like privileges and biases and assumptions, and I don't mean that to necessarily be like big, heavy weighted stuff. Sometimes it's the simplest stuff of, were you homeschooled, right? Like, did you go to public school or private school, or how many parents did you have? Like, in whatever way we might diverge from status quo shows up in the way we ask, in particular, closed questions. And so I think that's good to know when we're thinking about how sometimes the way that we ask questions can either support a solution or support a conflict. A good engagement, and in particular, for those of you that might have to do something like intake, a good engagement is gonna you're gonna ask both types of questions, right? If I'm completing an affidavit for someone who's filing an order of protection, I need some really specific data, right? I need to know exactly which day this happened and what happened, right? But what I might also need to do in order to get that very specific and perhaps traumatizing data from someone, I might need to start with some open questions, some broader questions, so that they can tell me what's important to them, right? Before I go into the data that I need. For example, in mediation, we use what's called an intimate partner violence and abuse screen if the parties have had a romantic or cohabitating relationship of any kind. We want to make sure that there isn't a history of violence, abuse, power, or control that would make mediation a bad idea, right? It could be dangerous for folks, or they might not feel like they can advocate for themselves, right? And so we start by doing a really broad intake where we ask people questions, we let them ask us questions about the process, and then we say, I have a questionnaire for you. But the first set of questions on the questionnaire are, tell me about your children. What are their names and ages, right? And we collect some broader data. How would you describe your co-parenting relationship right now? And later in about 15 minutes, I get to some very specific questions like, have you ever feared that your child would be kept from you, right? And so open questions tend to build stronger rapport with folks. Closed questions get us facts and data that we sometimes need. And if you have someone who's a long talker or who's having a really expressive experience, closed questions can actually help them focus on what's really important for the dialogue. So one question type isn't better than the other, but being mindful about how and when we use them is. I encourage you to think about what your default is. Some people default really strongly to one or the other. I'm going to pull my screen share back up. So you can see here, this slide just has some of the impact on the difference between using open and closed questions. So one of the other things that we do is summarize, and a few folks had this in the chat when I was talking about active listening. Summarization is a great tool. We use it because it lets people focus. It tells them that we hear them. You can repeat back. It does a great job of building trust and rapport. And this is also really important. It's a good little check on humility. It can help check your understanding of what's going on, right? If I say to you, I don't understand what you're trying to tell me, that might be pretty frustrating if you feel like you've conveyed a story to me. If I tell you, okay, I heard you say that the Wisconsin Dells are your favorite place, but I'm not sure I totally understand why. At least you know that I've been listening to part of you, to part of what you've been saying. And that can be really helpful. We also can use summarization when we're engaging in conflict to sort of pull together different pieces of information. So if you are that third party where you're getting to meddle in someone else's conflict instead of your own, sometimes summarizing what's happening for everyone can be really helpful for highlighting common ground, for highlighting areas where we need to do more work, and for sort of shoring up the conversation so that maybe we can move forward. People who are upset tend to repeat themselves a lot. Summarizing them lets them know that they've been heard. There are 3 different types of summarization, and we sort of do all of these naturally without thinking about them. Restating is where you paraphrase back in your own words exactly what you think someone has said to you and what's really important. Reflecting, and this was also, someone had popped this in the chat earlier, this is when you kind of mirror back someone's emotions, right? Like, you're really angry about this. This is really stressful for you. Right? I'm hearing like a lot of heartache from you about what's going on. And then there's also this idea of summarization, which is what we sometimes do, that's called a grand summary, where you might pull together a lot of things. When someone has told you a pretty lengthy monologue about what's going on, and they've kind of covered a lot of different ground, it can sometimes be very effective to do a grand summary and say, here are things I'm hearing from you. This is important and this is important. And then you can pick one of those things and move forward with it. And the grand summary is a really powerful tool for doing that. One of the things we've talked about a couple times is emotions work. So there are 2 different ways that we can thoughtfully engage with emotions. And they both have different, they show up differently, and they can have different impact on the speaker, or on the listener, excuse me. So one thing is simply to acknowledge an emotion, right? Like, and also the first time everyone tries this skill, they just go with frustrated. It's like the first word that comes to our minds. It's like everybody's default. You seem frustrated. People in conflict or court or legal battles are typically frustrated. Doesn't mean it's not the right word. But I will tell you that I often get a lot further with, it sounds like you feel trapped, right? Like that, oh, that resonates with me. Oh, she gets me. Yeah, I feel trapped. I feel stuck, you know? So acknowledging an emotion can help diffuse any resistance someone is having to an emotion, right? Like, if I feel really trapped and stuck, I might be really mad that that's happening to me, right? And I don't even want to acknowledge that I'm that upset about it. That can sometimes help and or impact. And when we acknowledge an emotion, it can help remove it as an obstacle to what's going on. Sometimes just having someone say, like, this is terrible for you. You feel so taken advantage of. Yes, I do. Like that, it feels just like that. I role play in simulations all the time where training mediators say things like that to me, and I'm playing a fake person who hired a house painter. And I still have that experience of like, wow, he really gets me, you know? And so just having someone acknowledge what's happening for you can be really impactful. And then the other option we have when we're looking at emotions is also thinking about how to, of making space to explore them, to figure out what are the interests and motivators under an emotional experience that are impacting it, that might have me stuck in a conflict experience. And if we can figure out what my needs and interests are, what's most important to me about what's going on, if I can try to resolve that, I'm going to resolve the whole conflict. And sometimes that's a lot more accessible. And so creating space for people to figure out why they might be having a certain emotion or what the impact of that emotion is for them can be really powerful. I once had a party in a mediation who, she said she was totally distressed. Okay. It was a small claims case at a court call. She owned a condo. All right. And there had been damage to her unit because of something that happened in the wall. And the condo association was saying, it's because of how your air conditioner was installed. It has nothing to do with us. You're responsible for it. And she was saying, no, it's part of the general building. Everyone is responsible for this. The association should support the costs, right? And so I was saying to her, and she was mad. She was nearly yelling in a small room at the courthouse, right? She was having a very emotional experience to what was going on. And what we know from neuroscience research, right, is that if I'm having an emotional response to what's going on, if this part of my brain is just up and on fire, I can't get to the part of my brain I need to make a good deal, right? You have all had an experience like this where you were in a fight, right? In a hard conversation. You're like, some people get hot, some people get cold, some people get really calm, right? But you're in a conflict and the other person says, oh, you're right. I hadn't thought of it that way. And then we say, and another thing, right? It's like, just because someone else has given you no info, and just because maybe you've won the fight, it doesn't mean that it's over for you physically. In fact, we know that what happens is that our cortisol and adrenaline levels, they continue to rise, even for some time after we're engaged in conflict, and that can have a real impact on our emotional response. So if I'm having an emotional response, I often can't make a great deal for myself. I can't get new information. I can't make a plan. I can't hear a good offer or make my own good offer. And so helping people kind of find a new space to communicate under and within their emotions can be really helpful. So this condo owner, she was at about a 9 on a 10-point scale. She was getting really upset. She had pushed her chair back from the table. She was kind of yelling at me. She was kind of yelling at the other party. And I was thinking, oh, she's having a really powerful emotional response. I need to help her come down from this, or we're not going to be able to continue a productive conversation. And so I said, it seems like you're really angry about this. I'm not angry. You're in a lot of distress about this. I'm not in distress. You're really upset. I'm not upset, right? She just didn't want me to name an emotion for her. And so I asked her a question. I said, what has the impact of this conflict been on you? And she lay her head on the table and said, I don't sleep. Now that's an awfully intense response to a conflict, right? But my attempts to name it as you're angry, you're in distress, those words were actually too small for her. And so by asking that broader question and her telling me she doesn't sleep, I was able to explore her emotional experience with her a little more. She was able to kind of get a stronger grip on what was happening for herself. And then, she was able to resolve it because we ended up talking about well, if you could settle this case today, would you sleep? Right? Like, even if you don't win, right? Is solving it better than winning it? And she decided that it was. And so she was able to make a deal. Even though she didn't win, she felt like she didn't give everything up, and that worked for her. And so, that's an example of when exploring emotions can be really impactful. So there are a couple of different ways that we can recognize emotions when we're speaking with someone. You can repeat yourself. You can change your tone of voice. This is some of that mirroring that someone was suggesting earlier in the chat. The pacing of your words can change. Paying attention to facial expressions. Let me tell you, I would rather mediate on Zoom forever than have to mediate with people in a mask. Because I don't know how you can tell what's happening for me, right? Like, you can tell if I'm smiling, but you really can't tell anything else, right? We really rely on being able to pay attention to someone's facial expressions if it's changing. We want to be mindful, of course, that we're not making assumptions about what that means, right? People certainly express themselves differently than one another and then ourselves. But if someone's engaging in one fashion and then their face falls, or they tear up or something like that, as a mediator, you want to be able to acknowledge that something's been happening for them. And then also a change in posture. Like I said, that woman literally, her whole body just down on the table, she kind of collapsed into herself when I asked her what the impact had been for her. And then also, when you acknowledge the emotions, we use these sensory words. So I've demoed it a couple of times here, but it sounds like, you appear, it seems like. And I will tell you what, when you try to apply this skill, you might get this wrong. But what's beautiful about it is that if I say to someone, it sounds like you're really angry, and they're not angry, they will often correct you. They'll say, no, I'm not angry. I'm disappointed, right? A classic, my dad was the king of that, right? Like, sometimes, and people can be very, they often do a good job of expressing to you what else is happening. So even if you miss the mark, that can be really helpful. Some people are kind of uncomfortable in acknowledging emotions, but what can be helpful when you do this is sort of naming why, right? Like, I noticed that you've made fists with your hands, and it seems like you might be angry, right? Sometimes if there's a reason that you think it, right? Like I hear your voice getting a lot softer, and it seems like you might be feeling sad, and making space for people, that can be, that can sort of be a nice way to talk about emotions if you're not completely comfortable just going in and checking on people. And when we explore emotions, here are just some sample questions, and you'll notice these are all open, right? Exploring emotions with someone, this is going to be pretty open question work. And then you might narrow it into closed question work, because that like works a little bit better for you, especially if you need to collect some data for someone, right? So another tool that we use when we're engaging with people in conflict, and I really love this one, is reframing. So if someone were to say to you, this is a great example of it. This is stupid. We've tried to talk about it before. All we do is argue. The reframe on that is, so it's important to you that you don't waste time arguing. This is an opportunity to make some progress, right? So what we're doing when we're reframing is we're figuring out what's important in what the speaker just expressed, and is there another way that we can look at that? Another great example I love is when someone says, she's always late, right? So the reframe on she's always late is, being on time is important to you, right? Being on time is important to you. That is a value-based, future-focused conversation. We can talk about why that's important to you. What happens for you when someone isn't on time? What does punctuality look like for you, right? That we can explore that in a really productive, future-focused way. Yeah. She's always late. That's a conversation about someone else's behavior, and it's past focused, and it's pretty hard to come up with a plan to move forward, and it's hard to understand what's so important to the speaker, right? Typically people who pride punctuality, when other people aren't on time, they feel disrespected, right? That question of why is punctuality important to you, that's going to get us to respect and disrespect and what that looks like much more quickly than if I come at someone and say, you're always late and I need you to be on time, right? And so that reframe, I think, is such a powerful thing to do. And if you're able to be mindful about your own experience inside a hard conversation or a conflict, or what someone is trying to tell you, if you're able to help them and support them with a reframe, it can be really, really impactful for moving us forward through conflicts and challenging conversations of all kinds. Those are the skills that I really wanted to take the time to cover with you today. I want to tell you a little bit more about CCR, and then I'm going to pull down my screen share and give us a couple of minutes for questions. So the Center for Conflict Resolution, we're Chicago's community mediation center. We mediate about 1,500 cases in 20 case types throughout all of Cook County. We have internships and externships. I have a PILI intern this summer. I have PILI fellows this summer. We also have trainings that are open to the public and private trainings. And if you are attending law school in Chicago, your school might have a clinic with us. So if mediation and conflict resolution is something that you're interested in exploring in your law career or in your professional career, please don't hesitate to reach out. I'd be happy to hear from you. I really appreciate you all coming today and showing up. I was telling Brent that the slot after lunch is not exactly a sought after one. So I am really grateful to you all for turning on your cameras and making that exercise a little more impactful for yourself and your colleagues. I do hope that you have a wonderful summer. Here's my email address. I'm also the only Ray Kyritsi, period, and I'm the only Kyritsi in Illinois, so pretty easy to find. Yeah, so I just want to open it up if folks have questions either about any of those skills, types of conflict you think you might anticipate, or anything else, because we have a few minutes left. I'm going to keep you here the whole time, though, so not asking questions doesn't mean you get out early. So if you have a question, you might as well ask it. It won't be your fault. Come on, somebody's got to be worried about a conflict of some kind. Anybody from Pili have some that you know you've seen that maybe folks should think about? Common dynamics that folks get engaged in?
Well, what about conflicts between domestic violence victims and abusers? I think that's one of the most common clients that some of our Pilis represent or interact with. Can you, with 5 minutes left, do you want to talk about?
Should I go into the entire history of domestic violence and as it relates to conflict resolution? Why not? For sure. Yeah, you can do that in 5 minutes. Yeah. So I think what's worth thinking about around that, if you've worked in intimate partner violence and abuse, or if you are maybe working at 555 West Harrison, which is the domestic violence courthouse in Cook County. I know that there are folks who are working all over the state here, but if you're doing domestic violence work, right? So what's helpful to know, I think, is just a little bit of history around the perspectives, right? So in let's say the 70s, right? Like mediation sort of burst onto the scene, right? And mediation was like, we're here, we can do anything. And mediators were like, we can resolve anything, yeah? And domestic violence advocates were like, no, you can't. You absolutely can't. You're not allowed. No way, absolutely not. And then mediators were like, yes, we can do anything. And that led to a very long, hard relationship between conflict resolution professionals and advocates, right? And I think that I can understand how everyone is wrong, and frankly, how everyone is right in that sort of picture. Now, when I was in law school, I had a 7-Eleven and I worked at what was then called Domestic Violence Legal Clinic and at Legal Aid Society. So I've done orders of protection and divorce as they relate to domestic violence, and ended up pursuing a career as a mediator. So I think some of the things that are worth thinking about are like what I was naming earlier, around like, is there a history of violence, abuse, power, or control that make having people engage in a conflict, simply put, a bad idea? Are we going to re-traumatize someone? Are we putting someone who has no autonomy into a room and being like, good luck, speak for yourself, it'll be great? But at the same time, if people, in particular, if they have to co-parent and there isn't an order in place that means they don't have to communicate with one another, and we don't give them the support of mediation, are we saying, well, there was an incidence of violence between you and maybe that's what ended the relationship and it was 10 years ago, and we're going to say, no, we won't, you can't access resources, right? So there are sort of answers on both sides that what all of that means is that whether or not mediation is a good resource in a case where there is a history of domestic violence is a case-by-case question and assessment. And at CCR and myself personally, we really believe that like every family in every circumstance deserves like a very specific analysis about whether or not the resource is appropriate for them. One of the key tenets of mediation is that it is voluntary. So if there is a party who's experienced domestic violence and they're saying, no, I don't want to do that. If there's a party who has perpetrated domestic violence and they're saying, no, I don't want to do that, they don't have to go to mediation. And that assessment for voluntariness, that's actually happening the entire time. People can be 2.5 hours into a mediation and be like, just kidding, I hate this. And it's over. We don't force people to stay in the room. So I really like to think of mediation as a resource, for parties, and not everyone is interested in availing themselves of it. It's not the right fit in every case. However, I think we want to make sure that we don't limit what resources are available to folks based on their lived experience, especially if they're asking for it, right? If someone's saying, I could really use help having a conversation with my ex, I would really like some support for that. We think it's really important to be mindful and create the opportunity for that without saying, well, no, it says here that you were once in a physical fight, so you can't. We also have some other standards that we employ, like if there's a history of knife or gun violence between the parties, no matter what their relationship is, we don't mediate between them because it suggests a level of violence and conflict that we just don't think makes mediation appropriate. But we do those types of assessments on a case-by-case basis, and it is considered a best practice for all mediators to do that kind of assessment as they look at every case. So there you go, a brief history of domestic violence mediation in 4.5 minutes. It's also like a huge field and very nuanced, and there's a lot we could talk about it. But I think I got us there.
Perfect. Thank you, Ray. And I think on behalf of everyone, thank you for this presentation. I think we always learn a lot about even just asking questions and the best way to get at the information that we need to get at, whether there's conflict involved or not. So, 100 muted claps to Ray.
Yeah, I'll take them. Thanks so much, everyone. I'm going to pop my email into the chat here for you. If you're interested in dispute resolution, in particular in Chicago or Illinois, don't hesitate to reach out. I've been doing this a long time. Happy to be a resource for you. I hope you have a wonderful summer in your placement. I know that most of you are in a place where you've done like half or a third of law school virtually. And I just don't think, and if 2 years ago I was like, do you want to go to law school online? I just don't think any of you would have been like, yeah, that's a great way to spend $100,000 or whatever, so I just want to commend you for continuing your legal education virtually. You're absolute heroes. And I really hope that you're, as you enter the legal profession, you get to do more and more in person because we're a really rad group. And being a Pilly is the only thing I should have done in law school and didn't. So good on you. I highly recommend it. It's my biggest law school mistake. So congratulations to all of you for being here. And for those of you who have recently graduated, congratulations. You deserve all the fanfare in the world. And we should have a worldwide party for you when this whole thing is over. So thank you all so much. My pleasure to be here. And I will see you all soon.